Hey everyone, it's Tico here, and today's tarot tutorial, following along in the PDF guide that's available for download in the links. If you haven't already downloaded it, it will really help out, especially as we're moving on. Now every video is just going to kind of build on the next. Everything in tarot kind of builds systematically on itself. So the next part we're going to be looking at, this is your tarot tutorial, and I called it alchemical elemental relationship. So we kind of covered a bit of the elements yesterday, and I kind of foreshadowed a little bit, but this is going to get back to like the sense of hermetic alchemy, and it's going to be really important, especially as we start looking at the next tutorial, which is going to be looking at the elemental dignities of the cards and how we're going to read how those interact with themselves and even within a spread, and then also even further into the astrology. So basically we're just going to start on what we call the alchemical elemental relationships. And so this comes all the way back from Aristotle. In fact, the picture here is Aristotle's transmutation guide, right? So you're going to want to reference that. We have fire and water, air and earth. And then in between each one of these elements, they were assigned certain characteristics that had to do with like a temperature and I don't know how you would really describe it when you say wet or dry. Wet, dry, hot, and cold. And they kind of went in between them, between the elements, and gave the elements their own definitions. So for instance, if you're looking at the chart, between air and fire is the word hot, right? Between air and water is wet. Between water and earth is cold. And between fire and earth is dry. Okay? So what that means, any result of fire, they would say, is both hot and dry. Water is both wet and cold. Air would be hot and wet. And earth would be dry and cold. And anyone that knows a Capricorn earth sign, yeah, okay. Anyways, so sorry, my little astrology joke there. All right. So when we're looking at how these relationships form between fire, water, air, and earth, then right, the best combinations are when they share their temperatures, when they share hots and they share colds. So fire and air are the best two elemental combinations together. They're both hot. Earth and water are the two best elemental combinations, right? Because they're both cold. Then when we look at what we would call balancing, they're a little bit neutral. They balance each other out. Those are when they have the shared properties of either wet or dry. So air and water are both wet. So they get along together. They balance each other out. And fire and earth are both dry. So they both get along together, this and that. And then you have the elements, how they negate each other or they clash. Also, we say opposites attracts, are when both the temperature and the property being wet and dry, are opposites. So fire and water, hot and dry, is the opposite of wet and cold. So those actually, they negate each other, or they can clash, or they can attract, right? As opposites attract. Usually they can attract and clash. Air and earth, hot and wet, and dry and cold, those ones will clash together. So there's a little, that's looking at the alchemy and these elemental relationships and how they were composed. The last part of this tarot tutorial then I wanted to talk about was kind of a conceptual model that the alchemists used regarding the elements. And this is a way then that you could use, you can look at it in tarot, especially when we're going to look at the court cards, which will be a couple lessons down, or a couple tutorials down, I should say. Also, when we're doing elemental or ritual magic, if you have an altar or you want to set up anything like that, this is where we can get in a playing around or calling on the elements. Remember, the alchemists believed that all the elements were these intelligences, right? They're forces. Okay, so what the alchemists believed then is you'd have to use a fraction model of eighths, is that there was no such thing as a pure element, fire, water, air, and earth. it was not, so like let's just use the example of fire, and we're using a fraction. It would not be 8/8 fire. All right, you want to start at like the 1/2 line. Let's say 1/2 fire, right? 1/2 water, 1/2 air, 1/2 earth for each one of the elements, okay? And then they believed it was just a little bit over. This is what made an element it define as itself. So they believed that each element was 5/8 of the pure element, and then 1/8, a sliver of each of the other elements, right? So fire was 5/8 fire element, 1/8 water, 1/8 air, and 1/8 earth. Water was 5/8 water with 1/8 fire, 1/8 air, and 1/8 earth. Air was 5/8 air, 1/8 air, fire, 1/8 water, and 1/8 earth. And then earth was 5/8 earth with 1/8 fire, 1/8 water, and 1/8 air. So that what this allowed alchemists to do would be like, let's say they wanted to, I'm just going to make something up, put out a fire, diminish it, right? They might call on the water element if they're trying to transmute it. Again, this is all symbolic, right? But whatever. If you're trying to transmute it, you could call on the water element, the watery part of fire. It's in there. It's that 1/8 element, right? And they would bring that part out to mitigate and transpose some of the other elements, right? So that would be the essential of like alchemical magic, okay? I guess the reason why this is important, and especially in the tarot, as we're looking at each one of these signs, so let's say a random card comes up in here. I'm just going to pull one here. 5 of Wands, okay, fire, right? So we know that even though this is a lot of fire, this is 5/8 of the fire, right? We're going to just, don't worry about the number right now. That there's a little bit of air, right? A little bit of that mental, the communication, that 1/8. A little bit of water, a little bit of feeling, right? And a little bit of earth, how this is manifesting all in there, right? So as we're reading deeper into just this card alone, and even without transposing anything, right? You can talk about maybe some of those aspects, like where's that little bit of feeling, where's that water in here, where's that air, and where's that earth in this overall card of fire, and how that's playing out when we know the meanings and stuff like that, right? So that's an example. Also, just as kind of like a key or side note that you might want to make note of, one thing that I always pay attention to, especially when we're looking at these alchemical elemental relationships and we're having all these elements in here, when you do a reading for someone else, let's say that all their cards are fire. So, okay, that will tell you that, yes, there's all this fire going on, right? But if this is, let's say they're coming in and they're really stressed out because of all this fire, then you're going to want to call in the element of water to maybe balance or negate some of that fire, right? If they want to temper that out, let's say they're really angry about something. I'm just going to use that as fire, an example, right? So that would be an aspect then, and you would suggest maybe some activities that tie them to that water element, with water being feeling, journaling, meditating, etc., right? So we can balance out, just looking at how many elements are prevalent. If you have one that's 1 or 2 that are really prevalent, how are they interacting in the reading, and how are they balancing each other out? Are they working together or not? That would also be another thing. Let's say if there's a lot of air, right? And that could be great ideas, great processes, but maybe a lot of confusion then and this and that. Well, the fire is that will, it's that drive, it's that way to go. Right? Well, air and fire get along really well together. So if there's all these air cards showing up in this reading, maybe instead of talking about practical things you could do at Earth, because that's actually going to contrast, or even the feeling part of, feeling into what you're thinking, that's okay. They balance each other. But if you really wanted to go with the best combo there, air and fire. So, okay, well, maybe choosing one of these ideas or these projects, right? And then putting your fire behind it, using that fire as that motivation to accomplish some of these ideas. Okay, so that's all just like theoretical examples of how alchemical elemental relationships can be applied in a reading and how the elements are interacting with each other. So my next tarot tutorial is going to be on the elemental dignities. So take your time, think about this. Feel free to post or email me with any questions, and I'll see you next time. Blessings.